I'm here to talk about Japan and how our new prime minister, what that implies for the future. And as Ryoko mentioned, I've also split my career between Japan and Korea. So many times when I go to Tokyo, they say, how is Korea catching up with us so fast? And when I go to Korea, they say, how can we avoid becoming like Japan? So I know there's a lot of interest on both sides of the ocean there. So I'm going to talk about make five main points. I'll just tell you at the beginning. First of all, the party, Liberal Democratic Party's victory in February provides Prime Minister Takaichi with a chance to have far-reaching reforms in Japan. And second, the government's ambitious spending plans and tax cuts may actually slow progress in reducing public debt, and that poses risk to the economy, especially as the population aging drives up social spending. Third, we're always focused on fertility. It's the number one priority again. Policies that better enable women to combine careers with children, improve work-life balance, and greater use of parental leave might help offset the decline in the birth rate. We also have to focus on other things because we find it's very hard to change fertility rates. So we have to try to raise employment rates for women and older persons, and also use more foreign workers in Japan. Fourth, we have a new growth strategy launched by the new prime minister. She wants to focus on 17 special sectors that has both risks and opportunities. For me, as a traditional economist, the key is not so much trying to focus on certain areas, but try to narrow the gap between big companies and small companies, and between manufacturing and services, and trying to use Japan's technology to promote productivity. And finally, at the end, I'll talk about the current problems in the world economy because of protectionism. Japan, of course, made an agreement with the U.S. last September to invest $550 million in the U.S. in exchange for 14% tariff. Now it's 50%. I'll talk about what I think Japan should do in this new world. So let me start now talking about the politics. So I'm not a political scientist. We have Professor Curtis here at Columbia, who's probably a big expert, but I'll just give you my impressions. So the LDP party, Liberal Democratic Party, CBO, it's been around since 1955, 71 years. And during 71 years, it was in power all except 6 years, 3 years in the 1990s and 3 years in 2009 to 2012. So the Japanese government was very stable. People say, is this even a democracy? Because we're not changing governments. It's always the same party year after year. But also within this party, there's many factions. So there is some difference. But over the past 20 years, we've had a revolving door where we have a new prime minister almost every year. Between 2007 and 2012, those are 5 years, I went to Japan 6 or 7 times, and I met 6 different prime ministers. Every time I go, a new prime minister. How can you have a legacy or develop policies if you're only in office for 11 months? It's just a revolving door. Of course, on this list, you see Abe-san, who spent 7 years and maybe almost 8 years, the longest ever in Japanese history as prime minister. So the question is, what will Takaichi do now that she has power? Over time, the LDP has become much less popular. So this is from the Pew Research Center in the US. You can see at the left-hand side that the unfavorable opinion of LDP has shot up to 2/3. And the center side, you see that only about 1/5 of Japanese adults actually identify with the LDP. Actually, they don't identify with any party because they're mainly independent. The right-hand side is the most worrisome. It says 2/3 are not satisfied with democracy in Japan. And I'm not a political scientist, but I find that very upsetting when you see that 2/3 are not satisfied with democracy. It's like Churchill said, democracy is the worst possible system except for all the others. So it makes me a bit scared when other people talk that way. So if you look back at what was happening in Japan, the LDP had 5.4 million members in 1990. Now they have about 900,000. So basically, the LDP is losing support. It's based on rural areas, older people, farmers, and these people are disappearing. So in 2024, we held an election, and it was a terrible disaster for LDP. You see on the first row, they lost 68 seats, and their Komeito, the coalition partner, didn't do so well. So they lost their majority in the lower house, the powerful lower house of the Diet, the first time since 2009. So this was a very bad experience. And then we had every 3 years, we had the upper house election, where half are elected. And there, the LDP, the dark green, ended up with only 120 seats, counting the 19 light green of their new partner, Japan Innovation Party. So this is the first time that the LDP did not have a majority in either the upper house or the lower house. A lot of people are thinking maybe they're going to disappear. In France, the Socialist Party has basically disappeared. We see parties disappear over time. Maybe the LDP is a dinosaur that's going to go extinct. But then Ishiba resigned in September last year. And then we had a new, Takaichi was elected president of LDP, and then selected as prime minister in the Diet. And then she called a snap election in February. And in this election, the LDP won 316 seats, more than 2/3. So that gives them a super majority. They can override the upper house. They have all the power. And then with their coalition partner, the Innovation Party, which is basically Osaka Party, they have another 36 seats. So they are in control. The opposition, which is now the Centrist Reform Alliance, Komeito plus the Democratic Constitutional Party, they lost 123 seats. So the LDP has total control for at least 4 years if they want. You have to have an election every 4 years for the lower house. So now we have a chance to have a leader in power for 4 years who can do things. So you can see how much different we have. October 2024, we had this green wave stopping about 1/3, and now it goes 2/3 away around that semicircle. So you look at Japanese history over the past 70 years, there's been a couple of prime ministers who've actually stayed longer than 1 or 2 years, who've had a real influence. So Sato-san, he was prime minister in the 60s, doubling income period. Then we had Nakasone, who was focused on privatization of state-owned companies, the railroads, the telephone. Koizumi, in the early 2000s, he focused on solving the banking crisis, trying to reform the fiscal system. And then Abe-san, and he did his Abenomics and 3 arrows and all that. So Takaichi has only 4 years. What will Takaichi do? Hopefully she will have some landmark accomplishments that will make Japan better. So let me turn first to the fiscal side. Why are we doing fiscal policy stimulus? So as you probably know, Japan has the largest government debt relative to GDP that we've ever seen. I remember in 2007 being in Japan and telling journalists, this can't go on. 150% is way too high. This can't keep going. And so I go back 10 years later, it's 250%. You keep saying, it can't go on. It's unsustainable. So it is a risk, but it kept growing. And why could Japan get away with it? Because who buys the Japanese government bonds? Bank of Japan, Japanese households, and Japanese companies. Only 6% are bought by foreigners. So they don't have this problem that Argentina has. Everyone leaves the country when they have trouble. Japan is bought domestically. But still, this is not a very healthy situation. So we made progress in lowering the deficit. You can see back in 2013, we had a deficit, or 2012, 9% of GDP government deficit. That's a big deficit. And over time, under Abe, we managed to lower spending back down to 38%. But then with the pandemic, it shot up to 46%. And so we had another big deficit. Over the past few years, the government has managed to cut spending back down close to kind of the pre-pandemic levels. So that's one thing, was this fiscal tightness that under the LDP. The second thing is we've had inflation. So usually we think of inflation as bad. In this case, when you're worried about debt over nominal GDP, inflation lowers that ratio. So on this slide, you can see back in 2011, 2012, real GDP was growing faster than nominal because we had deflation. The GDP deflator was negative, the CPI was negative. Over time, we got out of deflation, which lasted from like basically 97 to about 2017. And now we see the gap between nominal and real is getting wider and wider. So last year in Japan, inflation was 3.7%. So we're really blowing up GDP, and that makes the debt ratio come down. That's not a good long-term solution. If you go to 5, 10, 50%, debt ratio goes down, but the people will be worse off. So what is Prime Minister Takaichi proposing? Well, first of all, she talked about responsible, proactive fiscal policy. So responsible, we won't run up the debt. Proactive means we'll respond to the problems that we have to try to solve problems. The first thing she did was announce a fiscal package. So in Japan, they have a regular budget. And then during the course of the year, they all get together and say, we need more money. So they make a supplementary budget based on what region's been hit by a typhoon or what needs to be done. So she's announced a 4% of GDP fiscal package, which is very large. She announced that she would suspend the consumption tax, a VAT, which is 8%, for 2 years, and that will cost another 5 trillion yen. He talked about refundable tax credits, which would be basically a negative income tax for middle and low income, and then getting rid of provisional taxes on gasoline and diesel, more help for the SMEs who are always struggling against big companies, more grants for local governments, and then an income tax deduction on the personal income. So all this amounts to a fairly stimulative fiscal policy. Is this a good idea? Is this a time that Japan needs this fiscal stimulus? If we look at the forecast, the OECD did this forecast in December of last year, and you can see that we forecast. So as economists, I did this for 30 years. Now I'm a professor. I don't have to make forecasts. And that's a big blessing because making forecasts is really not fun. And we never know what's going to happen because if we get too much rain or not enough rain, our forecast isn't true. Or if there's a war someplace, it all falls apart. So someone asked a famous economist, why do you make a forecast? Because people ask us to do it. But it's not something we really want to do. But anyway, we forecast 1.3% for last year. That's more of an estimate. And 0.9% this year and next year. 0.9% might seem kind of low, but if you have to keep in mind, Japan's potential growth rate is now only 0.2%. So potential growth is how much you get if you get everybody working and all your resources employed, they can grow sustainably at 0.2%. Why is it so low? Because the population is shrinking. Productivity growth has not been too impressive. So if you only have a potential to go to 0.2%, you should be happy with 0.9. It doesn't mean you need stimulus when you're that far above potential. What is potential in the US? About 2%, because our population was growing, at least until last year, and our productivity is a bit stronger. So in OECD countries, on average, we have potential growth of around 2%. So Japan is a low potential growth country because of that. So if we do this fiscal expansion, one risk is that we end up with more inflation. So in Japan, the political debate is about affordability. That's what we hear in the US, affordability. Prices are too high. We can't afford housing, healthcare, food. So in Japan, the problem is real wages are always growing more slowly. The nominal wages are growing more slowly than inflation. So in 2025, we had wages go up 2.3%, prices went up 3.7%, so people lost in purchasing power 1.3%. So over time, things are getting more expensive. So if we have more fiscal stimulus, that tends to put more pressure on inflation, which means maybe we'll even have a larger decline in real wages. It also puts downward pressure on the yen. So I was in Keidan Ren in 1995 when the yen went to 79.5. And there were people in the building who were just stunned that we can't compete with the yen at 79.5 to the dollar. And now we're about 155 yen. So the next one I have it. So the yen is really undervalued based on purchasing power parity, which we try to adjust for different prices. If you go to Japan now, it is amazingly inexpensive. You can get a nice meal of udon and whatever for 500 yen. You can't get that in New York or Washington. So Japan, because of this weak yen, is very affordable, but it makes prices tend to go up, and it hurts the Japanese people. The other reason the yen is weak is because we have these low interest rates. So the real interest rate on 10-year bonds is 0.2. If you want yield on a bond, you go to the US where it's 2%. So we have a problem when we have higher bond yields. So in 2024, the Bank of Japan finally raised the overnight rate, the policy rate. It had been negative for 17 years. The negative interest rate of negative 0.1 or 0 for 17 years. So finally, they raised it in 2024, and now it's up to 0.75. Then we have the yield curve control. This is really creative thinking. They decided not only will we set the short-term rate, we will control the long-term rate, the 10-year government bond yield. So they said, we'll keep it lower than 1%. How do they do that? Bank of Japan has to buy lots and lots of bonds to keep the yield below 1%. So the Bank of Japan owns half of the outstanding government bonds at this point. Foreigners only 7%. And this yield curve control kept the bond yield lower by 1 to 3 percentage points. So what's good about that? Well, the government has to borrow to pay their debt. If you have 250% of the debt to GDP, interest payments could be very large. And so by keeping the interest rate below 1 and close to 0 for many years, that lowers your interest costs. So the Bank of Japan has ended yield curve control. There's no more quantitative easing, no more yield curve control, and they're tapering the purchases of JGBs. So over time, the Bank of Japan will buy fewer and fewer, about 4.1 trillion in the first quarter of 2024. We're down to 2.9 trillion. It's going to gradually go down to 0. So what's going to happen to JGB bond yields when the Bank of Japan stops buying JGBs? You can see those go up as well. So the interest payments by the government is close to 0. It's going to start going up as government bond yields go up. So this creates risk when you announce a expansionary fiscal policy. What happens to bond markets? Well, if you're in the UK, you do remember the experience of Liz Truss. He was prime minister for 49 days, and there were supermarkets having a gamble. What will last longer, this cabbage on the shelf, Prime Minister Truss? And actually, the cabbage lasted longer because she promised a lot of extra spending, but no revenue to back it up, and so the bond yield shot up, and she was pushed out after 49 days. So this is Japan. We started in April last year. We're 1.1% on the 10-year JGB. Now we're at 2.2, and that little circle point I circled, that is the day, January 19th, when Takaichi announced the suspending the consumption tax on food. So there was a little spike as people say this is getting into dangerous territory. So this is the one drawback. You have to be careful you don't lose the confidence of the bond market. So looking ahead, what's going to help Japan get out of this fiscal situation? Well, first of all, it caused it. You look at the red line here, that's Japan's public social spending. That includes healthcare, long-term care, pensions, social welfare, unemployment. So it's basically, in Japan, focused on the elderly. As the population aged over time, from 1990 to 2022, it went up by 50 percentage points. So Japan spends more on social spending than many Scandinavian or Nordic countries. Not because they have a generous safety net, because they have so many elderly people. So the spending is going up 50%. What will happen for the next 40 years? Well, at the OECD, we did a projection. And so you can see Japan over the next, the 2060, we project that spending, public social spending will go up another 13 percentage. That would take it from 25% of GDP up to 38. The blue is healthcare, and the green is pensions. And actually, long-term care is rising faster than healthcare because lots of older people are getting people come to their house and help them with daily tasks. So Japan has this big hurdle. As they get older, they're going to have to spend a lot more on public social spending. So for me, you look at this high debt, this compares to OECD countries, Japan really has to focus on a medium-term plan, put the debt ratio on a downward trend to get it back into a lower territory, so it won't be a risk to the economy. We did this simulation. What would happen if Japan kept doing the same thing, the baseline? Aging, we spend 30% more on public social spending. So the brown line is fiscal reform. In that case, we cut spending by 10% compared to baseline. We double consumption tax to 20%. It's now 10% up to 20%. We raise the pension eligibility age up to 70. If we do that, we could keep the primary balance only a 4% deficit. So it makes some progress, but still, if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that after bottoming out in the 2040s, long-term debt will be back on an increasing trend. So basically, we have to have fiscal reform combined with the green line, which is productivity-enhancing reforms. With productivity-enhancing reforms, we can have more GDP growth. That will allow Japan to keep its debt, to lower it to a more sustainable level. So if we have both the fiscal and productivity, we projected we could be down to about 110%, the OECD average, by 2060. That scenario. So let me talk now about demographics, because that fits into this big challenge that Japan has. So In Japan, we had fertility was very high in the 50s and 60s, and then it dropped dramatically in the 70s. We had a shock in 1989 when it got down to 1.57. Then in 2005, it fell to 1.25. And then Japan had a kind of a panic moment. It went gradually up to 0.45 by 2015, and then we've gone back down. So we're gradually declining each year. Every year for 10 years, the number of babies born in Japan has fallen. You can see the OECD average is about 1.6, US about the same. Korea, much worse situation, 0.75, which means basically by 2210 there won't be a FIFA World Cup with Korea because there won't be enough people to make a soccer team in Korea. So basically we have Korea as the outlier. Japan is not much better off. So this aging population also means that the employment labor force will decline dramatically. So population would go from 128 down to 63. And in this simulation, I assumed that fertility would stay at 1.3. I know when it was 1.3. And that immigration would stay at 100,000. And employment rates for men and women would stay at the same levels but for each gender and age category. So under that kind of situation, we'd have the population down by half, employment from 63 million down to 31 million, losing half your population by the end of the century. So not only do you lose the number of people, but you have a much larger share of elderly. So you look at this chart, we divide it into young people, children, working age, and older. So we're at 29% are elderly today. By 2060, that would be 38%. Now that 38%, a majority would be over 75, which is when healthcare, long-term care gets really high. So we have an aging and a shrinking population. So the thing that's different about Japan is this is happening so rapidly. So the UN classifies 7% as an aged economy, 14% as an aging, and 20% as super aged or very aged. So France went from 7% to 14. It took them 115 years. France was always trying to support big families because they worried about their neighbor to the east. Having raised my family in France, I knew there was also subsidies to having children. They always tried to promote children. And they will go to 20% in France. It takes 39 years to go to 20%. Japan did it 24 years to go from 7 to 14, and then just 12 to go to 20. And Korea is doing it even at a faster speed. So it's not just the fact they're aging, it's happening in a very compressed time frame. So this means the elderly dependency ratio, the ratio of elderly to the working age population, will go up very fast. So in Japan, we're at 53% in 2022, and we expect, given kind of the medium fertility projection by the United Nations, it would go to almost 80% by 2050. So that means you go from having 1.9 working age people for elderly to 1.3 for elderly. So by 2080, it'd be 1-to-1. So for every working person, one elderly. So that working person will have to devote a significant share of his or her income to that one retired person they're supporting. So Korea, of course, over here in the green, will be even in worse shape by 2050. So since 1989, Korea has done, or Japan has done many things to cope with this 1.57 shock. So we had an angel plan, angel, I guess, meaning babies, a new angel plan. We had more healthcare service, childcare services, more healthcare for mothers and babies. We had more public facilities and housing for families. We had improvements in the educational environment. We reduced the economic cost of child rearing, including for education. And we made the employment environment less stressful and more flexible for parents, and tried to change traditional gender roles so there'd be easier family life. And then we had a monthly allowance of 10,000 yen per month. What we find is if you give people an extra $100 a month, it doesn't really change their views on having children. In the US, you always read it takes $300,000 to raise a child. If you give me $100 a month, it doesn't change the calculus at all. And so there's really not much point in doing this. The Abe administration did a lot. They raised the number of childcare spaces by 530,000, then another 320. So the waiting list for childcare in Japan have gone down. And then they had free childcare, the Yochien and Hokyuen, for children from 3 to 5. And then we have fathers taking more parental leave. Koizumi, who's now the defense minister, was famous because his wife had a baby, and he took parental leave. But it was only a total of 12 days over 3 months. So he took a half day off every Monday, and he got 12 days. So he became famous for doing that, but it's not really going to change society if you take half a day off every week or so. So now the new government has a new priority. They say declining population is Japan's biggest problem, the one we don't really know what to do anything about. So Takeichi-san said, if we are to overcome the decline in population alongside the shrinking birth rate and aging society, we have to have a national discussion about how we should design the benefits and burdens associated with the social security system. That seems to imply that we have to think about, can we really pay pensions and healthcare for the elderly? So when you're over 65, per capita healthcare spending is 6 times more than under 65. So healthcare spending, in a sense, is kind of an elderly program. It's mainly for older people. At the same time, Takeichi's been pushing for somewhat tougher policies on immigration and foreigners. We've had a kind of an anti-globalist party, the Sanseito, has made it into the diet, and they are kind of outspoken against immigration. And so we have tougher rules on permanent residency and naturalization in Japan. So for me, this slide kind of shows the how fast this is moving. So the 1990s, if we compare the number of babies compared to the 1980s, it was down about 2.5%. In the 2000s, it was down about 10%. In the 2000 teens, it's down 22%. So in the 2020s, does that mean it's going to be down 40%? You see, every generation, if this continues, each generation shrinks tremendously. So eventually we'll be down to an extremely low birth rate. So that's why the government is viewing this as the most important problem. So what discourages or encourages the birth rate? First of all, young people in Japan don't feel very financially secure. That's true everywhere, but I think in Japan especially. So 98% of babies are born to married couples. So if people don't want to get married or don't think they have money to get married, then the fertility rate drops. So in other countries, of course, it's not just money. People have wider goals. People want career advancement. They want self-realization. They want money. And so people, cultural reasons, people don't want children. So that means you just can't give them money to have children. So we had a survey in Japan. This is by the Government Research Institute. They said that 80% of both men and women say they plan to get married eventually, and the desired number of children is 1.8. So it's very close to replacement. So if they do what they want to do, they would get married and have 1.8 children, and Japan would carry on with a population that doesn't shrink nearly as fast. Another survey asked, what are the conditions necessary for you to consider marriage? And 42% said being financially stable. And 10% said trying to find housing. So basically, economics is driving the decision on getting married, which drives the decision on having children. So there's much uncertainty about unemployment prospects. So you might find a job, but you work very long hours. You don't have time to have a social life. Or you might be a non-regular worker, making half as much as everybody else, and you don't build up financial security. So one really thing we have to do is try to break down non-regular employment, which is Korea's problem as well, and also try to ease the seniority-based wage system where wages start low, they underpay you, and over time your wage goes up very fast, and eventually your productivity is too low, and then they get rid of you because there's a gap between productivity and wages. So if we look at the relationship between marriage and children, the blue line is the 30 to 34 men. And so if they're making 2 million yen per year, only 20% are married. If they make 8 or 9 million, 80% are married. So we have to, they need more money to get married. For the 40s, the married group, 80% or 90% of people with 14 million yen per year are married. So basically what drives marriage in OECD countries in the past, as income went up, people have fewer children. Have a couple, and then spend a lot of money on each child. Now by 2021, as income goes up, fertility goes up. So there's not this trade-off we thought we had. Also in the past, when women work more, fertility goes down, and now we have a situation where as women work more, fertility goes up. So basically the solution that I come up with is that fertility depends on if it's possible, to what degree it's compatible to have children and to have a career. If it's feasible, then you can have women who work and have children. If it's not feasible, women tend either to not marry and not have children, and so you have a lower birth rate. And that depends on social spending to some extent, the role of fathers, flexible labor markets where women can come in and out of the labor force, which is not so easy in Japan, and the social norms. The problem in Japan is kyoiku mama. So social spending in Japan is focused on the elderly rather than families. 2% for the families, so it's gone up a lot. We focus more on the elderly because of healthcare and others, pensions. And then you look at OECD countries, Japan spends a relatively small share on family support. So the government could try to do more in that regard as well. Now the question on immigration. Now this is always very charged discussion. Japan has about 2.5% of foreign-born population. The OECD, the average is about 13%, varying a lot between countries. So in terms of the workforce, we're at 3.3% of the workforce is foreign-born. So most of these people are, the green are the trainees, foreign workers from Southeast Asia, and then the gray is students, the orange is the high tech. So this has tripled over 13 years, and now it's up to 3%. If this doesn't keep growing, if this freezes, Japan will have more serious problems in the labor market. So this little simulation is basically what can we do about fertility. We have 1.3. The baseline shows us going down to 32 million people in the labor force. If we were able to do reforms, this 1.3, the dotted line, reforms in terms of doubling inflows of immigrants to 200,000 and raising employment rates for older people, we can keep it up to 42 million. Or if we raise fertility to 1.8 without reforms, we could get 42 million. The best solution would be to raise it to 1.8 and have the reforms, you could get to 52 million. So it's not a question of just raising the fertility rate, it's a question of foreign workers and having older people work longer to try to maintain the labor force at a high level. Let me talk briefly about the fourth level on growth. We have a growth strategy. He basically wants to build so we have more resilience against foreign threats, so it's a national security, and also have more economic growth. I worked in the Reagan administration in the 1980s, and we had three big trade cases come to the USTR. So I was actually in the White House, but not USTR. Basically, the steelmakers said, we have to have steel to make tanks. So we had to put high tariffs on steel. So national security reasons, we need on steel. Then the people who make shoes said, we have to have tariffs on shoes because soldiers have to have boots. And without boots, we can't have a war. So we have to have tariffs on shoes and boots. Then the people who make clothes said, we have to have tariffs on clothes because soldiers need to have uniforms. If you don't have uniforms, we can't fight the war. So basically, everything was national security. So the economist is very frustrating. We have to limit imports of all these things because otherwise, we're not going to be able to fight a war. Anyway, that's the world we're in now, and there's some truth to it because rare metals is very important. So we picked out 17 sectors that are going to be the growth sectors. We'll have public-private investment roadmap. So the public sector and these 17 sectors will get together and make a roadmap of how to do investments. And there will be this crisis management for security and growth investment for economic growth. And she said we'll spend 7.2 trillion. By 2030, we want 50 trillion spent, that's $48 billion by public-private investment. So this is a huge amount of money that they're planning on or hoping for. So for me, as an old school economist, I think these industries are nice. Some are not high tech. Shipbuilding is certainly not high tech. Food tech is probably not high tech. These are important sectors. But when you give money to these sectors, you take it away from other sectors. And who's to say what sectors are going to be really important? So Japan in the 1980s, 70s, METI said, we want to be like the US. We want to have 3 car producers. Japan had 8. They said, you have to consolidate into 3. And METI's tried to push them into it, and they said no. And so they actually prospered and became very efficient, having 8 car companies. So I'm somebody who's always very suspicious when the government comes in and tries to plan the investment that's not going to be what would be best. So Japan used to be a high-income country. The red line is percent of the GDP per capita as a percent of the OECD average. So back before the bubble burst in 1990, Japan was 20% higher than the OECD average. The OECD is 38 high-income countries. You can see compared to the US, they got up to 84% of the US GDP per capita. By 2009, Japan was at the OECD level, and now it's slightly below. And it's only about 2/3 of the US level. So Japan's on this long downward decline in terms of income, in terms of growth. So how are we going to turn this around? Well, we have the population problem, but we also have the question of productivity. So productivity is simply how much you produce per hour of labor input. So Japan is viewed as a very hardworking nation, very productive, but actually they're hardworking, but productivity per hour worked is well below the OECD average. Longer hours for not as much work output. So why is it so low? For me, it's surprising because you think of Japan, you think of high R&D spending. They're the 6th highest in terms of R&D spending. How many Nobel Prize winners? I think Takeshi said 32 last week. I think 27 were in science. So we have all this science and technology. We have share of tertiary graduates. University graduates in Japan is the highest after Korea and Canada. We have all this human capital. We have technology. We have everything. Why is productivity 20% lower than the OECD average in Japan? It's always been kind of mind-puzzling. In Korea, you can also say the same thing because Korea is down here below, and they have even more R&D and even more education. The problem is, to my view, is the SMEs in Japan are very backward. Big companies are competitive. They compete internationally. But the small companies, 99.7% of companies are small companies, basically a medium. That means less than 300 workers. So they account for 99.7% of the firms. They account for 52% of employees, 58% of employees, and they account for about 52% of output. That means that the small companies and medium size are only half as productive as the large companies. So why the large companies, they can compete well, the small companies don't. So what should we do? This shows the international comparison. If you look at the OECD average, on average, the small companies with 10 to 19 employees are about 44% as productive as manufacturing, and it's less. So we see this gap is common, but it's more exaggerated or serious in Japan. So why is it SME productivity low? First of all, it's in the service sector. Service sector tends to be less productive, partly because services aren't as comparable. It's harder to change. You don't always want to change your bank or your telephone company. You always want to stay with the same provider. They don't have as much innovation or new technology. They don't have the human capital or the resources to invest. They don't participate in international trade and FDI very much. And they're small. The government gives them subsidies. If they become a medium-sized company or big company, they lose the subsidies. And so they have the Peter Pan syndrome. They don't want to grow up. They want to stay small and get government subsidies rather than become more productive. So we're basically subsidizing companies that are somewhat non-viable, stay alive rather than growing. What we need is startup companies, venture capital, that will take new technology and create new innovative companies. In Japan, venture capital is not the same as in the US, and it's harder to be an entrepreneur. If you fail, then you are criminal if you don't pay back your bank loan. So it's very hard to be an entrepreneur. So this is the service sector productivity in Japan is very low, partly because you have so many people there to wrap the package and bow as you get off the elevator, so it tends to be quite low. R&D in the in the SME sector is only 12% of business R&D. Maybe I'll just take one more minute. I know I'm getting over time. This is how will Japan cope with what's happening in this world? So for me as an economist, this is really tragic. We built a system after World War II that everyone is, poor countries have converged towards rich countries. This open trading system to me has been not perfect, but it has helped poor countries become medium-income countries, high-income countries. This whole system is being broken down. If you look at what's happened in 2025, this happens day by day, things are changing, but I try to get the main points. So 2024, 25, April 2nd, we had the Liberation Day. They announced the tariffs. Japan was supposed to have a 24% tariff. They got delayed and delayed. September 4th, we had this US-Japan agreement. And then on February last month, we had the Supreme Court strike down the tariffs under the IEEAP. So September 4th agreement, Japan would face a 50% tariff from the U.S. on almost all goods except higher tariffs on cars and steel. Japan will provide special access for U.S. industries such as aerospace, agriculture, food, energy, automobiles, and other things. Rice, so they'll open their market more to the U.S. And then the most unique thing is that Japan promised to invest $550 billion into the U.S. And the U.S. would be the one who decides where that investment goes. So this is really unheard of. This has never been part of trade deals. And Japan is not alone because we have the same deal with the EU, Japan, or South Korea, Taiwan, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and the Persian Gulf. And so this new framework, they hope, the promise is that it will reduce the U.S. deficit, with Japan. So what's happened so far? 2025, U.S. exports to Japan went up 3.9%, while imports from Japan fell. So that was what they wanted. But the bilateral trade deficit is still large, 63.9 billion, so it's still very large. The U.S. set records last year for the largest total trade amount, total exports, total imports. So the economy did very well in terms of trade, but the trade deficit got bigger. So you put all these tariffs on, we had a 3% average tariff, you raise it to 70%, and the deficit gets bigger. So what does that tell you? The tariffs don't determine your trade balance. That's something that people cannot understand for some reason. Tariffs do not determine trade balance. Trade balance is determined by your saving investment balance. So Japan exported less, China exported less, but countries like Vietnam, which is a subsidiary of Korea and Japan at this point, exported more. Thailand exported more. So it just shifted from China to other countries. The fall of the trade deficit with Japan was more than offset for the U.S. by larger deficits for other countries. So we have to remind people and tell people that tariffs will not cut your trade deficit. It's a fallacy that's been around too long. It's the saving investment amounts. The U.S. spends too much, we have a large government deficit. The household sector spends a lot, so we have to rely on inflows of foreign capital. So basically, what's going to happen? We outlawed the IEEPA. So now Trump has 150 days under this new thing called Section 122. So he can impose a 50% tariff for 150 days. We've already had like 9 days, so we're down to about 140 days. You can use other remedies. We have the 201, which is basically U.S. industry hurting. 232 is a defense issue. 301 is unfair trade practice. So you can do that, but it takes time. You have to go through the International Trade Commission. They have to vote and say, is that really unfair trade practice? Is it really viable? And so they have to go through time. So basically, we're going to have a situation where 6 months, the tariff will collapse. And then we'll have to negotiate a new tariff. So Japan has leverage, $550 billion of promised investment. So I think they should use that leverage to try to keep the tariff at a reasonable level. So let me stop here, and we have time for any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you very much.